Our digital heritage visualization course really focuses on that part of digital heritage which looks at visualization and representation of people and objects in the past. It's quite distinct from traditional digital heritage courses, which focus a lot on informatics and data management inside the heritage domain. It's different from museum studies or museology in that although some of the work we do would be useful in museums in terms of presentation, we focus specifically on the visualization and representation aspects of digital heritage. The students get exposed to a huge range of technologies, both in data acquisition, where we're using latest techniques like structured light scanning or laser scanning, photogrammetry techniques, and some quite specialist heritage visualization and recording techniques such as reflectance transformation imaging. Students would be exposed to all those different technologies and get a chance to take the data that they're acquiring through these technologies and build projects using games engine technologies such as Unity, 3D modeling technologies such as 3D Studio Max, quite a range of video and audio associated softwares as well. The students have the opportunity to work on a huge range of projects, and that's both on the types of material they'll be studying in the projects or they'll be utilising. It could be important heritage buildings, it could be particular artefacts, it could be stories from the past. Increasingly, they focus on issues around intangible cultural heritage. And also they deploy the technologies for digital heritage visualization in a range of really imaginative and creative ways. And we're talking here about video technologies, we're talking about game-based technologies. There's been a real uptick in the range and depth of game-based technologies that have been deployed in heritage visualization, as well as the type of interactives that you might see in a museum context or in a visitor site context. We've got very good relationships with some of the most respected figures in the heritage domain, specifically in the digital heritage domain. So as well as them contributing to the course directly as guest speakers, they have in the past worked with specific students on specific projects to supervise them and give them guidance. And it's also worth saying that because the Heritage Visualization Masters sits alongside Masters also running here in serious games and virtual reality and Masters around creative audio, there's experts from those domains to speak to the students specifically on issues around games development or issues around audio. And these are really useful insights for the students on the heritage pathway. As well as being very focused on teaching, we're a research active division inside the Glasgow School of Art. So at any one time, there's always a substantial number of active research projects, and we're very, very keen to get the students involved wherever we can in working directly or at least learning from the research projects as they're taking place. And we discovers research projects which have ranged from maritime heritage to ocean governance and climate change, projects focused specifically around communities and their engagement with their heritage. There's quite a big portfolio that we're always very keen for the students to gain benefit from.
In my view, heritage visualization is a very wonderfully interdisciplinary subject. It combines historical research, digital technology, and narrative art, not just to recreate how the things look like, but to give cultural heritage new life and meaning. Starting at GSA made me realize that real heritage conservation isn't just about preserving something, it's about creating new connections. It let people touch ancient buildings in virtual spaces, understand lost crafts through digital tools, and hear the stories behind silent objects through digital storytelling. History stops being just an echo of the past and starts a conversation with the future.
We have students who come from a broad range of backgrounds. We've had students who've have come from heritage-focused backgrounds like archaeology or for classics or for history. We've had students who've come from a fine art background who bring really well-developed artistic and creative sensibilities. We've had mathematicians. We've had a broad range of students who have got genuine interest and desire to work in the heritage domain, and they all bring with them different skill sets. And the way that the course is designed, I think that broad range of backgrounds really enriches the student experience. We've been very successful, I think, in the destinations that students ultimately go to. We've had quite a number of students who've gone on to work in the museum sector, as you would imagine, heritage focus, including Science Museum and the Maritime Museum here in Scotland. We have students who've set themselves up in professional practice, doing heritage visualisation on a contract basis. We've had students founding organisations in, for example, African Digital Heritage was founded by an ex-student of ours. We've had students working with Anglia Ruskin University and the UK Antarctic Trust, who've been working down in Antarctica, as students working also in the higher education sector, for example, at the Advanced Research Centre at the University of Glasgow, and quite a number of students who've gone on to work for national heritage bodies, for example, Historic Environment Scotland. We've had a number of students, still have a number of students working there right now.
What was great was like the access to some of the different equipment we got to trial, particularly something like structured light scanning, which is quite inaccessible to do outside of an academic context like this. What was good about that as well was going back to this idea of different disciplines, and it was interesting working within a group where people's backgrounds varied, and so people had different skill sets and things that really kind of complemented each other. It was quite different from my background, having done like a fine arts bachelor's degree. There was definitely a lot more focus on kind of academic skills and technical skills that I think I was really looking for a master's course, was like this idea of kind of carving out a niche of like expertise after having done like a kind of general fine arts like practice course, which like was, I think it was nice, this idea of like kind of marrying these two things together, and kind of where that would sit myself in terms of like looking for work afterwards.
It's really worth making the point that heritage as an academic discipline has expanded massively over the last 10, 15 or 20 years. And it's kind of been in response to national programmes around heritage. Also, it's been in response to an expansion of profound interest in heritage from not just the educational and research sector, but from the creative economies, and in particular, of course, from the tourist economy. So this combination of technical skills, creative skills, critical thinking skills around heritage that the students from this Masters come out with really positions them very, very well to take advantage of this expansion in heritage, whether it's coming from a national level, whether it's coming from the higher education research sector, or whether, again, I'm saying it's coming from tourist economies or increasingly the creative economies too. But I also think it's true that having that balance between the technical and creative really generates a very, very viable, transferable skill sets that I think a lot of employers are looking for. These are students who not only are master of some of the technical skills involved, but they have critical thinking and creative thinking as well. And it's that package, I think, is extremely useful, obviously inside heritage, but in other domains also.